Khrushchev described the Kremlin's goal of economic aggression in this way.
The threat to the United States is not the ICBM, but in the field of peaceful production. We are relentless in this, and it will prove the superiority of our system.
This is Berlin, the Brandenburg Gate. Nikita Khrushchev slammed shut the last gate still open between the Soviet Empire and the free world. Why? Because before the wall went up, about 1,700 captive people every day showed their contempt for communism by leaving East Germany through that only remaining exit to freedom. Today, 1 billion people, 1/3 of the world population, are dominated by communism. In less than 20 years, the communists have captured approximately 1/4 of the world's territory. The speed of communist expansion is startling. The communists are working to carry out their master plan for world domination by every means at their disposal. Threats, power politics, propaganda, subversion, military force, and economic pressures. On the economic battlefront, the free world still holds the lead. In the production of steel, cement, crude oil, and electric power, the Western nations are still ahead. But what of the future? 5 years, 10 years from now. The Kremlin's strategic purpose in controlling the East European economy is to bolster the Soviet war economy, to add to the Kremlin's military and industrial buildup, to provide a surplus of goods and technicians. By these means, the Kremlin hopes to wage more effective economic warfare against the West and subvert the new countries. East Europe offers the Soviet Union that potential extra economic and military strength which could mean the margin of victory for them in their goal of world conquest. But Khrushchev has a problem in East Europe. The people there are overwhelmingly nationalistic, deeply religious, and anti-communist. That is why the Russians must maintain 26 divisions in East Europe and why Berlin is ringed by a wall. Ever since communist armies overran East Europe, the Soviets have been trying to brainwash the people to make them willing slave labor for the Kremlin. But they haven't succeeded. And one big reason why is the work of Radio Free Europe. For over 11 years, Radio Free Europe has been the free world's strongest counter-voice to communism in East Europe, one of the few offensive instruments available to the West in the Cold War, one of the few ways we can effectively put pressure on the communists. For 18 hours a day to Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, and for 5 hours a day to Romania and Bulgaria, Radio Free Europe is on the air refuting communist lies, nullifying the effects of their propaganda with legitimate news analysis, religious services, exposés of communist methods, and programs about the free world and the democratic system. In a real sense, Radio Free Europe is a free press in the enemy camp. Radio Free Europe regularly monitors about 50 communist radio stations and news services, strikes back hard and fast at Kremlin propaganda. Radio Free Europe deals heavily with the internal affairs of the communist bloc, often bringing listeners news of their own countries that the communists conceal from the people. The accent in programming is on news. Every hour on the hour, there is a 10-minute news summary, followed by world press reviews, commentaries, and news analysis. Such programs make up roughly 50% of RFE's broadcast schedule. What you're hearing now is a $150 million sound. That's the amount the communists are estimated to spend annually in attempts to jam Western broadcasts. How effective is their jamming? While it interferes with some wavelengths, jamming does not by any means drown out all wavelengths. Right now, 85 to 95% of Radio Free Europe programs can be heard behind the Iron Curtain on at least one frequency. Each program is broadcast over several frequencies simultaneously. This high rate of effectiveness is possible because RFE maintains 28 powerful transmitters and relay stations that represent over 1 million watts of power. More than half the families in the captive countries own radio sets capable of receiving Western broadcasts. Hundreds of interviews are conducted every year with refugees and travelers from behind the Iron Curtain. In recent surveys, to the question, did you listen to Western broadcasts in your country, more than 80% of these people replied yes. 70% had listened to RFE. Where figures do not tell the whole story, events do. For example, when Richard M. Nixon visited Warsaw as Vice President, the communist radio made only a minor announcement that he would be in Warsaw. But Radio Free Europe was on the air night and day with full details of the visit, including time schedules and the route Nixon would take from the airport to the city. That route was jammed with hundreds of thousands of Poles who turned out to cheer the Vice President with a tumultuous reception that far outdid the drummed-up affair the communists had just staged for a Khrushchev visit. Letters from behind the Iron Curtain testify to the impact and effectiveness of Radio Free Europe. Typical is this letter from a Czechoslovakian listener.
Listening to Western broadcasts has become our daily bread. The intensity of listening increases with events of international or worldwide importance. The most listened to station, of course, is Radio Free Europe because of its all-day program.
East Europe is Khrushchev's stepping stone in his overall plan to dominate the Western world and eventually to destroy free enterprise. Without the captive people's resistance to communism, the Soviet Union would go a long way toward achieving its goal. In time, these people and their countries would be completely integrated into the Soviet system and economy. Soviet pressures would then penetrate Western Europe, and the Kremlin would intensify its assault on the political, economic, and cultural life of the entire free world. Communist economic pressures, combined with political, military, and psychological pressures, plus subversion, would present an ever-increasing threat to the free world economy and to our own standard of living. Total Soviet absorption of East Europe would enhance the Soviets' military power. The 450,000 Soviet troops now tied up in keeping their satellites under control would be free further to threaten the Western world and to promote Khrushchev's plan for world domination. Complete success for Khrushchev in East Europe would also mean a political, social, and moral victory for the Soviet Union in other parts of the world. Neutral nations, newly created democracies, and emerging countries would find themselves easier prey to Soviet designs. American survival as a free country with a free economy depends to a large extent on the continued frustration of the communist effort to assimilate East Europe. RFE broadcasts not only help keep alive the spirit of freedom among the people of the satellites, but also help deter the communists from harnessing the potentially greater industrial power of a totally communist-oriented East Europe. Estimated gross national product figures for 1970 tell a significant story. As long as West Europe, and the United States maintain their economic as well as political and military power and unity, the security of our free enterprise system will be maintained. But if Khrushchev succeeds in the complete subjection of East Europe and in dividing the Western allies, the communists could achieve world conquest through so-called peaceful coexistence. The free world, led by a vigorous America, cannot afford to hand East Europe to Khrushchev by default. Today, we still hold the margin for victory, and Radio Free Europe's dynamic countervoice to communism helps keep the communists on the defensive behind their own Iron Curtain. Radio Free Europe's voice must remain strong and clear. The decision is yours. Radio Free Europe as a private, non-profit network depends upon your support. RFE's current goal for maintaining its effectiveness is $11 million. Think of it as part of the price of freedom as you know it. Think of it as insurance on our way of life. All of Radio Free Europe's fundraising expenses are separately financed so that every dollar you give is used to help the people behind the Iron Curtain to help us in the battle against communism. At one of his earliest press conferences after being inaugurated, President Kennedy reaffirmed his support for Radio Free Europe.
First, I want to say a word in behalf of Radio Free Europe, which is now making its annual appeal for support from all our citizens. For more than 10 years, this enterprise has been reaching out to people in Europe, Eastern Europe, with truth and devotion to liberty as its message. While this radio is at work, with listeners numbering in the millions, the competition of ideas in these countries is kept alive. The individual Americans, by giving to Radio Free Europe, may be sure that they are bringing a beacon of light into countries to which millions of us are tied by kinship and whose hope for freedom all of us must share. This is a peaceful concern, but a firm one. Radio Free Europe needs and deserves our generous help.
Imagine America surrounded by minefields and patrolled by armed guards. For that is exactly what it's like today in East Europe. Imagine if the only way you could hear such songs as America the Beautiful was from a Radio Free America. And suppose the only way you could learn the truth about world events was from a radio station located thousands of miles away. Would you listen? Would you support that radio station? Send your contribution today to Radio Free Europe Fund, Box 1962, Mount Vernon, New York. That's Radio Free Europe Fund, Box 1962, Mount Vernon, New York.